Bum, 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 bum.
Welcome to the Good Energy Project with Lou Connor, a surprisingly hopeful show about the invisible economic forces that shape our lives, our homes, and our future on planet Earth.
Kia ora, happy 2025. Today I'm excited to be continuing my exploration of decolonisation in Aotearoa, and in particular what our role as Pākehā is in that. In November last year I took part in Hikoi mō te Tiriti, and it had a huge impact on me. It felt incredible to move within such a vast sea of people, all united by a cause and showing such kindness and generosity. I've never felt so settled in my role as tangata tiriti. To me it felt like the beginning of a new era, and I was filled with a sense of belonging and hope. I'd love to live in a country which was led in that spirit. So this interview today follows on from that experience, and I'm really excited to be talking to Rebecca Sinclair, who is a researcher, educator, and one of the co-founders of the Pākehā Project, which is an initiative to support Pākehā, or white assimilated New Zealanders, to figure out what we can do to support the process of decolonisation, and where we just need to get out of the way. So I met Rebecca recently at the Wellbeing Economies Alliance conference, and I took an instant liking to her. I overheard her talking about how colonisation and racism are crystallised forms of trauma or something like that. And I was fascinated and wanted to hear more, as trauma is something I've been thinking a lot about. And I guess the thought that I've had recently is just noticing that our economic system seems to be like a trauma system, the way that we behave towards each other, hoarding stuff and behaving very individually minded seems to be the kind of way that you would act when you're traumatised. That connection just kind of struck me recently, and so when I heard you talking about trauma, I was like, oh, that's what I'm interested in. Can we talk some more? And so following that, we met up for a tea the other day and had a really long, really great conversation. And following on from the hikoi, it just feels like a good time to have this conversation.
Yeah.
And so, welcome.
Oh, that's so beautiful. Thank you, Lou. It's just really gorgeous to be here.
Oh, so nice. Thank you. Well, I've got a few questions which I ask all of my guests. So the first one is, where did you grow up?
Yeah. So I grew up in Tāmaki Makaurau, in all sorts of places around Tāmaki Makaurau, because we kind of moved a lot. So we moved house a lot, and I think that's been a little bit foundational in some of my feelings of unsettledness. So we had lots of different houses. We lived at one point on the top of a lunch bar in Hobson Street.
Oh, okay.
We lived in Remoera, we lived in Meadowbank, which is where I was born. Mm-hmm. We lived in Pakiranga, and then we moved to Tauranga, mm-hmm. and then back to Auckland again, where I spent the rest of my time till I was about 24. I moved down here to Pōneke.
And do you remember when you were a child what you loved to do and what absorbed your energy?
Oh, yeah. Anything to do with imagination and play. Mm-hmm. I can really, really remember being with my cousins or kids in the street or my siblings or friends of my parents' kids, just engaging in these kind of games where we would just imagine our way into the world, and it would be with whatever was there, wherever we were. So that might be, at the beach or on my grandparents' farm or, just in the house. But we'd always be kind of making up these ways of being in the world. And I just can remember losing myself in that and the absolute sort of joy of it all.
Do you remember any highlight imaginary worlds?
I just think like they were just constant. So it wasn't like we didn't return to one or anything. It was just always this kind of like wherever we were, that would trigger some new thing that we would be doing. And, you know, there'd be a whole lot of getting together and working out with each other what the rules were in this particular game. And, and in fact, a lot of that was almost more exciting than the actual game that we might go on to play ourselves. It was like the working out of it all and the seeing who was going to do what when and you know what the purpose of it all was. So you know, I can remember doing these really beautiful walks on my grandparents' farm in Atiamuri, which is sort of down between Tokoroa and Taupo, with my cousins, and like there was this kind of stream in there which had little bumps that we called the sugar lumps, and just going on these kind of amazing adventures through the sugar lumps and finding creatures on the way, and sometimes, unfortunately, bringing them back home, which we were then told was not actually okay.
Oh, like what,
little baby ducks and tiny little rabbits and all sorts of things like that.
Oh, wow.
But it was just this beautiful world of imagination.
Do you remember when you first came across money?
That is such a great question, and I don't know that I do remember that. Apart from, I think, maybe if I think about, there's a couple of things that come to mind when you say that. And one of them is when I lived in Tauranga, telethons were big. And we would always organise our friends in the neighbourhood to raise money for things. And I can remember having these big garage sales. We would be raising money for telethon.
What's telethon?
So do you not know it?
I
so
do.
Telethon
I
was like this,
it, but I can't quite remember what it was.
This big fundraising thing that would happen every year on TV.
Oh,
and there'd be people manning the phones, and people would ring and pledge money, and there'd be the totals going up, and you'd have a big kind of light board with flashing lights telling us when a new total was reached, and celebrities were involved and people doing mad things, and it would run for 24 hours. And, you know, I can just remember being really involved in that and that whole concept of like, you know, trying to raise money for, you know, which was it's supposed to be for charity and all of that kind of thing, and thinking that was like really cool to be part of. So I think that's probably my first sort of really feeling of the concept of making money. Maybe. And I think that's it. And then maybe the other one is.
And did you help raise money? Like,
So it was all about. Around to... So we'd go and I can remember. In fact, I think I went on TV. Took this bucket of money that we'd raised and gave it. And thought that was so exciting. It would have been a flash. The camera would have got me for 1 minute as I handed my bucket of money over to.
But you were contributing.
Yeah, I was contributing, and it felt really, really good. You know, like felt so amazing.
And I think the other day we were talking about how this work of decolonisation is a lot about challenging these underground stories that we live our, or beliefs that we live our lives by. And you know, people have had analogies of you can't notice it because it's like the water we're swimming in, or it's like the wallpaper that's always been there and you just don't even notice it. But I just wondered if you could share a bit of your experience of how you became aware.
Oh yeah, that's so interesting, because I guess from as far back as I can remember, I've always been interested in what sits underneath the surface of things. I think there's something to do with the way my brain is wired, and I've always kind of worked things out through understanding the sort of underlying patterns and then being able to work out what to do on the basis of understanding those patterns, which meant that I was really good at languages at school. I loved studying languages. I did French and I did Latin and I did Spanish, and since I've done some Te Reo Māori, and what I loved about all of that was this beautiful underlying logic. So you didn't have to know all of the single individual things. As long as you understand the logic underneath it, you can kind of work out all of these amazing things. And that's the same with science. So I was completely attracted to science and maths for the same reason. Like, I just loved understanding the systems and the logic that sat underneath everything. And so that it wasn't about memorising individual things. It was always about trying to understand what gave rise to things so that I could work them out. That's a real thread that runs through my ways of being, I think. I was never really satisfied with looking at what somebody presented me. I really had to understand how it got there before I could accept it as a fact or a thing. And so one of my bugbears has always been when people give me steps, like instructions, which are in a list of one, first step this, then step, like I hate it. I just cannot follow instructions like that. I have to understand what the logic that sits underneath it is so that I can then understand whether those instructions are appropriate. Otherwise, if I can see that those aren't going to work, I'm not ever going to follow them. And it's, it's something really powerful in me. It just, I have huge resistance to that. To following instructions. Well, and following templated instructions. And my suspicion is that might be something else that we end up talking a little bit more about.
So how did that lead you to?
Well, so what happened was, I really think about it, and I've always been interested in what sort of sits between things rather than the things themselves. And I know we had that conversation when we were meeting for tea. And so even when I went on to, I started out, I did a science degree in chemistry and maths, and then I went on, started a master's, thought, I don't think I want to be in a lab for the rest of my life. And I went and I changed and I did an architecture degree, which kind of brought me into contact with all sorts of other sort of discourses around art and te ao Māori and feminism and all sorts of beautiful things that just expanded my mind even further. It was an amazing sort of time. But even when I went on to start to do research, my master's, and then, to continue on with research as an academic, I couldn't ever really focus on this one strand of things. I always ended up, so architecture, I never looked at it directly. I was always looking at it through other kind of contexts and lenses. My master's was about the old children's dental clinic building in Willis Street, and I looked at that building through the lens of dental nursing. And so I brought those two things together and started to make connections between them. I did research into the way that dress and the clothed body intersects with architecture. And in that, I was always interested both in the architecture and in dress. It wasn't like just looking at one or the other.
You get them to talk to each other
absolutely,
and see what comes out.
And I'd look at architecture through feminist literature. So I'd looked at it through the novels of Virginia Woolf. Because I got really frustrated that we barely ever talked about women in architectural history and theory classes. It was always about these giant male hero architects, the Starchitects.
The Starchitects.
Yeah, and that just, I just thought that's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard of. So I just was really interested in exploring these kind of other ways in. And that is, I think, where my interest in kind of decolonisation came from.
Through feminism?
Through feminism, definitely. Yeah, through feminism and specifically actually feminist architectural theory.
Which so recognising that the built environment has been built according to an idea that centres men.
Absolutely. And more than that, actually even looking underneath it at what are the things that architecture talks about. It talks about boundaries, talks about like really solid lines of walls, and then what happens when you break walls down and you start to, on architectural drawings, get these little dotted lines. What does that refer to? So it starts to explore this idea about territory and boundaries and property. So I was really interested in the idea about how property was about this bounded ownership, and how do we get outside ideas of this bounded sort of ownership. And
normally you think of designing a building within the boundary of a property.
Yeah, that's right, exactly. And then that got me into all sorts of other really interesting things about the role of just inhabitation in architecture. So we'd often talk in architecture about the building as though the building was like a thing in and of itself. But buildings are not buildings unless they're inhabited. Otherwise, they're just like sculptures sitting there in space. And yet the inhabitation of that and the sort of messiness of that inhabitation wasn't really ever addressed. So those are the things that really started to interest me, the sort of impropriety of it, the mess of it, the things that other people weren't really looking at. Those are the things that really interested me, because I could see that they were actually giving rise to a whole lot of things that we weren't looking at. The sort of intangible, the invisible,
and the people that aren't being looked at? Or?
So absolutely. The people that aren't being looked at, the points of view that aren't being looked at, all of those things started to come into real kind of clarity for me over that time.
And when they started to come into clarity, did that bring feelings like, were you implicated in that, and how did it?
I remember starting to get really frustrated. That was when the beginnings of my extreme frustration would start, which I've kind of carried with me for quite a long time, because I started to, at that point I was working in a university and I was in a leadership role, so I sort of started to take on more and more leadership roles, mainly because I think I kind of kept asking questions, and I think they thought in the end it was probably better to keep me in the tent asking those questions than just leave me outside asking difficult questions. But I used to find it really frustrating that people couldn't see the world the way that I saw it, because I saw it very much in terms of this kind of contextual, interdependent realm, not a realm of objects, a world of relationships and how things shift and change due to those relationships, and that they're changing all the time. So I find it really easy to see things and understand the kind of consequences of actions and understand what led things to things, and because that's the way that I've tried to navigate the world a lot.
And so you had extreme frustration.
Yeah, extreme frustration at the fact that we do things like, I can remember being at university on a group that was looking at, for example, Māori and Pacific student success. And we'd talk about success and wanting to uplift Māori and Pacific students. And I just could not get a handle on why were we not talking about what success was in the first place. This definition of success that says, well, success is achieving these kinds of grades in this kind of course as individuals, and if you do that, you're successful. I was just sitting there going, why are we not having a conversation about what success even is? Like, how do we know that that is in fact success? And what do we need to achieve that kind of a success? Well, that's a lot about, I don't know, focusing really directly on this one thing, pushing all of the rest of the world out so you can focus on this important piece of study. And there are all these people that have got families and interconnections and things, and it was like pushing that aside was what made you successful. And I just thought, that makes no sense. It's completely illogical. So much of my experience in organisations, and my experiences in the university organisation, was about this way that we would just not look underneath anything. We were looking so much at face value and so much at kind of direct correctives on things. So here's a thing, right, let's stop the thing. And
knock that thing with a hammer.
Knock that thing with a hammer. And, we're not really interested in the fact that what happens when we knock it with a hammer. How do people respond? What does that then do down the track? And what about all of the other people that are standing around and looking at that? There is no understanding of the complexity of the system in which we are sitting. So I think my sort of real sense of the ecology of the world was building through this kind of trying to understand the sort of underground forces that were at work. And not understanding why people couldn't see that doing things with others collaboratively was actually a really desirable thing, and how do we create the conditions for that to happen rather than just, I don't know, forcing people together and saying, right, you need to work together.
How does the Pākehā Project come in with that?
So the Pākehā Project, I suppose, was because I had started really trying to understand what was sitting underneath these kind of ways of being and doing in the world that seem to be everywhere, and that I was looking at and thinking, this is completely
really
illogical.
stupid.
It's really stupid because we're not taking into account any of the contextual stuff, any of the relational stuff. We're only looking at things as though everybody's a separate individual, and all things are separate from each other. Like disciplines are separate from each other. And I could not understand that. And because I was involved in these kinds of teaching and learning leadership and things, we started to do some work around how do we take a different approach to engaging with te ao Māori and thinking about our Māori and Pacific students. And what we did in our college was we started to explore, well, what happens if instead of using frameworks that are sort of based in a Western cultural frame, we inverted that. Like we'd have a course on Māori art, for example, and that would just sit on its own, and some people would do it and other people wouldn't. Or a course that was on engaging with te tiriti, for example, and that course was always positioned as like a core course that students would do in their first year, but then they would leave it behind and it wasn't connected to anything else. And so it just seemed really weird to me that we'd do that. And so we sort of switched things around and said, well, what would happen if we introduced a framework that came from Te Ao Māori to our curriculum and our pedagogy and then made everything else fit into that? What would happen if we did that? And we kind of embarked on a big project around that. Lots and lots of mistakes, lots of, all of the things that you can imagine that were problematic about that. But there was also some real learning about it as well, because I think that's another part of me as well, is that nothing is black and white. We just cannot cast things into one bucket or another. There's so much that's both and everything. So, so there was some really beautiful things that came out of that too, which was a real shift to the culture in the organisation that I was in. And that's really what got me into thinking more about the Pākehā Project. So, did you
engage with Māori?
Yeah.
And were they in the college? And
so we had
the culture changed?
Yeah. So in that process of doing that big project, which I was leading, but I was doing it in association with our Māori staff, there was a sort of a staff reference group at the time when we started, and they were the ones who were bringing the ideas. So it was about, how do I work with them? What do I need to do that's going to bring their vision to fruition? How do I need to help and assist in order to do that? And it was a real learning experience for me, because I really had to recognise what I didn't know, which was just so big, and become an incredibly humble learner.
Did you have any clangers?
Oh yeah, always clangers, and I still clang. Like I'm going to keep clanging for quite some time, I'm sure, because that's the nature of learning. Everything's changing all the time, and so we're always going to make mistakes. But I think the thing I learned though was absolutely to listen and to let people lead me, and for me to try to do what was required for that to happen. That's the way that I tried to approach it. Didn't always work. Yeah. Because also, as you go through processes like that, people change. Different kind of people came in and out, and you always have to form new, trusting relationships with them. And that's not always easy in an institution that is a colonial institution, which doesn't think about relationships at all. It sort of just imagines that we can do things through documents and org charts, and then that's how it all works. So there was a lot of work to do. But I think the story I like to tell about this is that in some ways it wasn't the curricular changes that we made that really made the shifts. What it really was us engaging with the kind of deeper values of Te Ao Māori and kind of enacting them over a period of years, not just at the time that we were doing the curriculum changes. And what I mean by that is things like eating together, cooking together, cleaning up after each other, caring for each other, really paying attention to the quality of the connective tissue in our organisation, so that we could actually have a relational basis for being able to work together. And the moment I think, for me, I could see that it worked, or not worked, but I could see things coming to some kind of fruition, was this moment of going, oh, wow, this is a change. And we at Massey, where I was, there was this big project to build a new marae, Te Rau Karamu marae. And it was a very long process, partly because of the very difficult worldview clashes that were going on through it, even though the university probably didn't recognise it all the time as a worldview clash, which was part of the problem. So it was about a 5-year process, and it was really cared for and looked after by the group of Māori staff who were working, the kaimahi Māori who were working on the marae, and they were doing that under really difficult circumstances. Anyway, it finally came to the day where the marae was to be opened, and it was beautiful, beautiful opening, starting at 5 a.m. And every single person in our college turned up to that opening at 5 a.m. with their family, with their whānau. We had little kids running around. This was at 5. It was so packed and so crowded. And everyone was there, and they weren't there because they had to be there. They were there because they wanted to be there. And the other part of that was that they all brought kai with them. And they brought kai so that we didn't take kai away from the kai that was there for the manuhiri. And so we cooked for ourselves up in our sort of shared kitchen. And I just thought, oh, that's the moment. That's the moment where I could really see that shift happen. So yeah, it was really beautiful.
And did it have an effect on people? Like, what kind of an effect did it have on?
Well, I think for many of the staff, it's a real feeling of like belonging, like a belonging to something bigger than them. And I think that real feeling of that is the thing that's helped them carry that on because, they're doing their own thing. There's all sorts of beautiful work going on in the college. I'm not there. It's nothing to do with me. It's to do with all of the other people who are there. And it's just been a really beautiful thing to observe. So, yeah. So that kind of, I think, real noticing of those deep cultural, the soil, the deep kind of cultural soil that's going on underneath things. And then my real recognition that deep cultural soil was not really the kind of soil that the university could either see, recognise, know what to do with, was where the Pākehā Project, for me anyway, emerged. Because I'm the co-founder with my tuakana Louise, beautiful Louise. For her, it's a different story, a different trajectory, but for me it kind of came out of that. And this absolute clarity that these two world views, were not compatible with each other.
Yeah.
And that's the thing that's really driving me at the moment, the sense of this worldview that we think of as so sophisticated, this orthodox Western worldview that we've inherited. And actually, I think it's quite an unsophisticated one. I think there's a lot... It
leaves you quite alone and
cold. It does,
cold.
because it doesn't necessarily connect that well to the reality of this living, relational, breathing, ecological world.
Yeah. One thing that we talked about the other day was this. I've noticed that in a lot of young people, and especially young Pākehā, sort of flattened by a sense of shame and are shrinking back and not bringing their energy or their skills forward. And I find it really heartbreaking. And I experience it myself, I think.
Yeah. So that, you've just so hit on it. So I think about like my role in the Pākehā Project when I'm asked what is it that I do. I've been saying a lot. I'm really helping Pākehā come back to life because I think it is a vitality thing. Like it is about the sort of reconnection with the living world, which includes us. We are the living world too. And we've been kind of treating ourselves as though we're like computers encased in flesh. And that is part of this worldview issue. And I think we'll start to be able to link that back to the things that you talked about at the beginning around trauma and how trauma then starts to play out in our kind of economic system and things like that. So I think for me, and I want to really emphasise, this doesn't just come from me. This comes from all of the discourse that I've been engaged with, the people I've been reading, listening to, speaking to, lived experience, like all of those things are part of my understanding of this. It's not about like me coming up with some idea, but it is a sense that we've been living in a world where we believe that abstract knowledge is superior knowledge. And abstract knowledge is really knowledge that is literally decontextualised from the world. It's this idea that we can, in our mind, come up with a world, work it all out, and then enact that in some way. But actually, our minds and our bodies are not separate. They are the same thing. It's body-mind. It's not mind or body. And even our kind of Western science is caught up with that. And for me, I think Indigenous knowledge systems already know that. We don't need to come up with new frameworks for a way that Indigenous knowledge systems already explore. And that connection, that real kind of reconnection with self, for me is part of that process of maybe halting some of the trauma that comes from separation, that comes from the separation from the world, comes from separation from each other and from ourselves, you know. So if we don't understand all these feelings that are inside us, if we just sort of treat them as something that we need to kind of like get rid of, oh my God, you know, I'm feeling terrible, but I mustn't feel like that. And
Can you say something about, so a lot of people say, I can't have trauma, I'm privileged.
Yeah, that's just not true. It's just not true. You know, in some way, like I guess one of the things I've been thinking a lot about is that material privilege is one thing, but that doesn't necessarily lead you to, I guess, a broader sense of privilege. Like sometimes that can lead to impoverishment of all sorts of other things, spiritual impoverishment, your emotional, psychological impoverishment. That sense of privilege sometimes can separate you out from others, and in that separation, that becomes actually a real sense of disconnection, and it's disconnection from others and from a kind of environment of care, from a beautiful sense of connection with everybody else. That is where trauma happens. You know, like when things become so overwhelming that you can't deal with them yourself. And if you don't have anyone else to help you deal with that, then that's when it gets locked in, this kind of overwhelm.
I read on your website, the body keeps the score.
Bessel van der Kolk is he speaks obviously a lot about that, as does Gabor Mate. He's another really good one to go to in relation to trauma, and particularly the sort of trauma of disconnection as children, as babies. And so some of those really early disconnects that we have from our caregivers are the things that do give rise to traumatic responses in us. So, you know, everybody experiences trauma of some kind, because we're not here to classify trauma into some kind of hierarchy of value and worth, which is, I think, another thing that we do in that orthodox Western worldview, where we try to taxonomize everything and
in a
compare
hierarchy,
it to each other and say...
You're more traumatized than me.
Yeah.
I was just picturing, like, the world is shattered.
It's fractured.
In a sort of fractured state.
Yeah, and that's, I mean, I really believe that's a worldview thing. We've been so acculturated and educated and indoctrinated into this idea that the world can be broken down into separate parts. And then if we can just take each of those separate parts out, work with them to understand them, then somehow that's going to enable us to understand the whole. We can put it back together again. We can now understand the whole.
Yeah.
But actually that's not true, because the world isn't separable. It's not separable. It's continuous. It's relational. It's changing and evolving all the time. And so we're basing our entire approach to the world on completely false assumptions, on a logic that is wrong.
On a traumatized...
Yeah, a traumatized kind of a logic that says you are separate from everything. Because as soon as we start to think that we're separate, then we create models which then enact that. And then we go and we make, I don't know, businesses, and we make societies, and we make universities where everything is separated out, where, you know, we've got separate disciplines and they're all completely separate from each other, and they don't have anything to do with each other. And we've got a government that is broken up into departments, and each of those looks after a separate thing because, hey, you know, health and the environment are completely separate. You know, it makes no sense.
And I started this project focusing on economics, and you know, it quickly became obvious that that's just one part of the living world. And the real distinction is more between worldviews. Yeah,
that is really where I think it is. And for me, that's also where racism is able to be more understood, where systemic racism is able to be understood, because what happens is we do this thing where we believe that really hyper-rationalist scientific worldview is the only way to understand the world. Now, in saying this, I'm not trying to say that science is wrong, because I love science, I completely believe in it, but it is fallible and it's partial. It's really good at certain things, but
it tends to chop things up.
But it does chop things up, and we start to then think that that's actually reality when it isn't. And so what often happens then is that things that sit outside of that paradigm, that scientific paradigm, get looked down upon, get treated as though they're a bit woo-woo, or,
Woo-woo, yeah.
or you know, like any like stories about like taniwha are, that's just like a fairy story. Like there's so much of this that goes on. Even in our New Zealand curriculum, the recent curriculum rewrite, where there's this perception, there's this distinction between forms of knowledge, and one of them is biologically primary knowledge and the other is biologically secondary knowledge. And what the people who are involved in that curriculum rewrite are talking about is that biologically secondary knowledge, i.e. abstract knowledge, is superior to, is a higher order than biologically primary knowledge. And I think that itself is the perfect example of that kind of Cartesian
mind-body split.
That's actually been part of our problem. It's part of what's causing the issues that we're facing, because we're treating everything as though it's an object when actually we're part of the world, not separate from it.
So do you have any hope?
I do have hope. The reason I have hope is that I just think so many more people understand this now. I think so many more people are starting to see the breakdown of these old systems that are just not working anymore. They're not fit for purpose, and people can start to see that. All those people are sort of like forming these beautiful lifeboats of coherence and kind of coming together and talking to each other, like you and I, or the people on the Pākehā Project. It's people who are starting to go, oh wow, there is actually this whole other way of understanding the world that we've been told is kind of nothing or immaterial or intangible. But actually, we can feel it. We can see it with our own eyes. We can experience it. And those old ways aren't working anymore. And I really think that's happening. I can see these beautiful kind of moments where people are reaching out to each other and coalescing into community. And that is really how systems will change. It's where the paradigm will really shift. It's like, Thomas Kuhn's structure of scientific revolutions, where he talks about how paradigms change, and they don't change all at once, and they don't change from the top down. They change from these kind of pockets where people are starting to do new things, and then eventually that becomes the norm.
Can you take us to a pocket?
I think so. One of the pockets I'm really interested in at the moment has been, so I've just come back from doing a warm data lab host training with Nora Bateson, and then met all of these people from around the world who are also thinking about this and exploring this in lots of different ways. It's so beautiful to see that you're not the only one. The experience of belonging to this international community, and that's just one of several that I've been engaging with now that are really trying to take this in different ways.
Data.
Yeah, warm data, which is really about understanding ourselves as ecology, understanding our systems as ecology, and thinking about the relational data that sits between everything, which can't actually be measured or quantified or grasped or controlled or any of those things. We have to kind of move with it and understand it in different ways. Yeah.
Cool, yeah. So, we talked about being in part of the hikoi, and also the Pākehā Project focuses on te tiriti, and I just wondered why you feel that's so significant.
I think because te tiriti, I've always thought that it's this, we're so lucky to have it, not because it's worked, but because it holds us into having this conversation. And it's the conversation that's been going on with Māori ever since te tiriti was signed. That just has continued. But tangata tiriti, we've really only recently come to this conversation and to start to really understand what it offers us. And so it's a moment for me of going, here is this other worldview that's right here where we've got it. We've got it with us. We can learn from it. It's the most amazing, amazing thing to have elders who we can walk alongside and who can guide us in this. So the Pākehā Project is really about helping Pākehā, I suppose, kind of develop some humility around the worldview that we have, and we do that by actually just talking about what is our worldview. Let's really look at it. Where did it come from? Trace it back. Let's look at its whakapapa. It's just actually going kind of right back and seeing how we think and act and be and do and value the way that we do. Because once you start to see it, then actually people can be trusted to go with that.
Yeah.
They don't need to be like forced to, I don't know, adhere to some standards or some moral values or any of those things. They can start to see for themselves how much more sense it makes.
And you said, I think it was on your website, figuring out the work that we can do and the work that we
don't
that's
do.
not for us to do.
Yeah. And so I think for Pākehā, it's like, recognising that the things that are stopping Māori from thriving are often the systems that we've introduced for everybody. So that whole thing around these universalist ideas that currently this government seems to think are very appropriate for everybody actually came out of a very particular cultural worldview. And it's a cultural worldview that is problematic for all of us. It's one that says that we're separate. It also says there's a hierarchy of worth that comes from that great chain of being, that some people are superior to other people, and that can be manifest in a whole lot of ways. Currently, meritocracy is the way that we do it, but even meritocracy has been designed and developed by the people who were in power in the first place to kind of mirror the qualities and the characteristics that they had. So we're still living, I think, in a culture of dominance.
Yeah, and the other day we talked about the inner colonizer.
Yeah. So for Pākehā, understanding this worldview and where it comes from, that's what I think it helps us do. It's like our superego, which is really, and I call my superego my kind of inner colonizer, which is all of the voices telling me what I should do.
Yeah, and like, who are you to say that?
Yeah, who are you to say that? You don't know enough to be able to say something like that, or, really, you're not good enough. But all of those inner voices come from the systems that we've set up in our colonial world. And I think a lot about stuff like the mental health crisis at the moment that apparently has just appeared, but actually, of course, like everything, has got a very, very long deep roots and a long tail. But basically, our whole ways of being in the world and of doing things and learning and achieving and all of those things are tied up with this idea that there are standards that we need to meet and expectations, and we need to keep achieving this next thing or the next thing or the next thing or the next thing. And every time you achieve something, then there's something more that you need to achieve. Now, if we go through the world where we're always told we're not quite good enough, is it any wonder that everybody turns up to therapy saying, I just have this terrible feeling of not being good enough?
And the poor therapist.
We're not going to be able to fix individuals when it's actually systemic. And that worldview of telling us that we're not good enough, of keeping us in competition with each other, that's the worldview that is
correctly placing the disorder. My partner's a therapist, and that's one of her tenets is correctly place the disorder if it's
where it belongs.
A societal thing.
And I think probably most of the disorders that we have are societal, and we are still not owning up to that. You just think about how baked into I think about our education system, obviously, because I've been part of it, but how baked into that system it is that, you're not quite good enough here, we're going to rank you, you're going to know exactly where you sit. It's not good for
It's very demoralising.
It really is, and yet we continue to do it.
Or very pressurising if you're at the top.
Yeah.
Do you have a sense of what's possible in Aotearoa?
I think so much is possible. And what I really notice is that when we really pay attention to relationships, like real relationships, not transactional ones, not, somebody who's going to help me achieve my next whatever, but actual relationships where we are with each other, we are eating with each other, where we genuinely are developing these kind of bonds of love and affection and friendship and, what real relationships are, then suddenly so much becomes possible. I'm really experiencing that with the Pākehā Project. That's what we're doing with our group of alumni we've just run our third cohort, and we're sort of recruiting for our fourth.
Ooh, can you tell me what the course is? And
so the Pākehā Project leadership journey is it's a beautiful journey for Pākehā who are really interested in exploring what their role is in honouring Te Tiriti o Waitangi, from a sort of genuine and authentic place. So rather than the sense of, right, what are the things I have to do? I need a list. I need a list of things that I should do to be a good Pākehā. It's much more about trying firstly to understand ourselves, understand our whakapapa, understand how we are grounded in this land, on this earth, get in touch with our own selves and be able to start to look at our culture and ourselves for what it is, in order to then be able to move into right relationship with Māori. Often in te tiriti education, there's a lot of kind of quite intellectual understanding of the history and all of those things. And those things are super important. I don't want to put those aside. And lots of people are doing amazing work on that. What we're interested in is, okay, once you know those things, what do you do with that? Like, what do you do with that knowledge? And you referred to this idea of shame and guilt and all of those things. Well, we don't want people to dwell in shame or guilt. One of the things that we say is that we're not responsible for what our ancestors did, but we are responsible for carrying it on. And so our responsibility is to kind of know who we are, where we've come from in all senses of the word, not just like what our family tree is and the journeys of our ancestors, although those are important. Actually, what's our ancestry? What are the sort of stories that have shaped us? What's our worldview and why do we do the things the way that we do them? And once we can start to do that, then that really puts us in a much more chilled place to be able to understand what our role is and what it isn't. And what it is really that sense of working with the Pākehā systems to see what's fit for purpose and what isn't for being in relationship. Because at the moment, the kāwanatanga space is not a relational space. It's definitely built on, I don't know, building those boundaries that we talked about early on, those kind of rigid kind of lines through the law, through legislation, rather than actually understanding what a relational world could be like. So we're really trying to help Pākehā come into relationship with themselves, with each other, and with the more than human world.
And what would sort of help you? Like, what are you up against and what would help?
I mean, we're up against, at the moment, we're up against a very reactionary, conservative bloc that doesn't want that kind of progress to be made. Is very fearful, sadly, about this idea of anti-racism and decolonisation and what tino rangatiratanga might mean. And I think that fear is really driven by a lack of understanding, and that's not said I don't mean to patronise in that way. That's what happens when you sit and you're only talking to yourselves and each other. And I think there's also this kind of fear of being dominated, and that's really a projection of the way that culture works. And so
if you've dominated someone and you don't want to be dominated back, you have to...
But what if the someone that you've been dominating is actually not interested in domination? Which is actually where I think we're heading, and more people are starting to see that. I think more people want to move into this relational world rather than one where there's a domination ethos. It's not really serving us at the moment, as we can see if we look around the world. I suppose the other thing I just add is I think that our Pākehā, our cohorts of Pākehā Project people are now creating their own ripples and building their own relationships and continuing to kind of seed this much more embodied, much more sort of in touch with their own spirituality, with their own ways of engaging and understanding the land and the earth. Those are the things that we really explore, understanding our own ancestry and really being able to sort of step outside of that orthodox worldview to see what happens when you do, to maybe go on those slightly more wandering and meandering paths to discover.
I liked what you said about creativity. That decolonisation
it's a joyful, creative act. It really is, because what it's doing is going outside the rigid furrows. I think of them like these kind of furrows in the ground that we've traipsed again and again in very straight lines, and we stick to them. What it's doing is it's allowing us to move outside of those and to discover this whole world that's right there, available for us to sort of play in. And that's really beautiful.
Oh, I love that. I was also wondering, what does decolonisation look like inside you?
That is a fantastic question, and I think that links back to that inner coloniser thing that we talked about. So for me, one of the things that I have really noticed in this process is that I used to do a lot of things like whenever I would come to do something, I would plan everything to the nth degree because I just didn't want to take any risks that I might not be able to do something, and I was fearful of making mistakes and all of those sorts of things. And so I would just really try so hard to make sure I had every I dotted and every T crossed before I went and did something like an interview or a presentation or any of those things. And I've really learnt to let that go and to trust myself in the moment with the knowledge that I have, with my intuition and my interoception, so that sense of understanding what the signals my body is sending me, is telling me about a situation, and being able to draw on the knowledge I have.
Oh, yeah.
And that has been really, I think, game-changing for me.
That's quite radical.
It's really radical and has shifted. It's helped my mental health. It's helped
yeah.
my work. And as part of that,
You can tap into the resources
you really
around
can,
you.
yeah. And you can understand this sort of relational field that you're in and how to navigate it, how to dance with it, I think.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah, yeah. So,
Oh, cool.
yeah.
That's great. I wanted to ask you, who are the people that have influenced you or your heroes?
That's a really beautiful question. I've got so many because, as you can imagine, it's quite meandering, maybe, is how I'd put it, but I'll name a few. One of them is one of my beautiful lecturers at architecture school, whose name was Sarah Treadwell, and she was just the most amazing person at kind of allowing for this opening up of connections between things. So I'd definitely put her up there. And then one of my current ones is Bayo Akamwalafe, who is just the most extraordinary thinker, scholar, activist or post-activist and decolonial thinker. And I participated in an amazing course that he runs called We Will Dance with Mountains into the Cracks last year.
Amazing.
With a big community from around the world. And it was a really beautiful experience of really breaking down that reliance on kind of white ways of doing things, and where whiteness is not about white people, it's about a kind of an ideology and a worldview and a way. So he really has influenced me a lot. Nora Bateson has influenced me a lot. As I said, I've just recently did some training with her, which was really extraordinary. Veronica Tawhai, just beautiful human who, as well as being an incredible scholar and educator, she really operates from an ethic of love. And then the last person I'd note is my beautiful tuakana Louise Mara, who, has mentored me through a process of getting to know myself better and really thinking about these kind of issues around what it might mean to be Pākehā in Aotearoa, New Zealand.
And she's Tūhoi.
She's Tūhoi and Pākehā, and she thinks of herself as a braided river.
Oh, that's nice.
And she really is the kind of amazing human who is there with all of her being kind of over the top of, I think of her like this beautiful tree, and she's the kind of canopy that is over the top of all of us.
Oh, that's so nice.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, well, I might ask my final question. If you imagine that you're 80 years old and you're sitting in a favourite chair surrounded by people you love and you're looking back at your life, and you've got a nice drink.
Yeah.
Looking back at your life, what do you feel most proud of?
I feel most proud of the sort of loving connections I make with people. And the fact that I so come from the perspective that love actually is the only way. And I see that with my daughters. I've got 4 daughters, and they just fill me with joy all the time. But actually it's that sense of real love of all of the people that I come into contact with, and treating each person as a beautiful, sacred being that's what I'm really proud of. Yeah.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you have anything else to add?
No, just that I would just invite people to be open to each other and to the possibility that the things they don't think are relevant may in fact be.
Who would you want to replace the inner colonizer?
Oh, yeah. Well, just an inner, joyful, loving fire. Grandmother.
Grandmother.
Inner, joyful, loving grandmother. That's what I
yeah,
think would be.
yeah.
I would like to replace my inner colonizer with.
Nice.
Yeah.
Yeah. That sounds great. Oh, well, thank you so much.
Oh, thanks, Lou. It was beautiful to talk to you.
Yeah, you too.
In
Yeah.
our strange, meandering conversation.
Yeah. That was the Good Energy Project. If you'd like to access more interviews, writing and illustrations, you can find them at thegoodenergyproject.substack.com. The shows are also available on Apple Podcasts and Spotify.